The room smelled of lilies and rubbing alcohol. Harlow Ashworth lay still beneath ivory silk, an IV taped to her hand, the monitor keeping a soft, patient rhythm. Lamplight caught the mirrors and threw it back twice. Dean Prescott knelt at the bed in a flannel shirt dusted with roofing grit. 3 guards stood at the door, silent. A lawyer read from a folded page. "You have been legally married to a woman who will never know your name," he said. "A poor single dad, forced to marry a billionaire CEO in a coma." Dean said nothing. He looked at her hand and did not let go. 6 days earlier, Dean had been on a ladder in 94-degree heat, tearing curled shingles off a rental roof he didn't own, for a landlord who was 3 weeks late paying him. The kind of heat that made the tar paper soft under his boots and his shirt stick to his back before 9 in the morning. That was when the black car pulled up at the curb below, quiet and out of place on a street where nothing was ever quiet or out of place, and a man in a gray suit stepped out and said his name like he already knew the answer to a question Dean hadn't asked yet. "Mr. Prescott." Dean Prescott. Dean came down the ladder slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, sizing the man up the way he sized up anyone who showed up somewhere they clearly didn't belong. Depends who's asking. "Silas Doyle." The man didn't offer a hand. "I represent the estate of Warwick Ashworth." The name meant nothing to Dean. He said so. "It will," Silas said. "In about 10 minutes. They talked on the porch of the house Dean was re-roofing, because Silas refused to say more than pleasantries standing in the yard, and Dean refused to let a stranger in a suit follow him inside, where Della was finishing a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table. Silas laid it out plainly, the way men do when they've rehearsed something difficult enough times that it no longer costs them anything to say. Warwick Ashworth's only daughter, Harlow, had been in a car accident 6 days earlier. She was alive. She was not conscious, and by every account the doctors had given, she might not be for a long while yet. Her father's will contained an emergency provision, drafted years before his own death, that activated automatically. The moment she became both incapacitated and unmarried, full medical guardianship and temporary voting control of her shares in Ashworth Capital would pass to her nearest living relative, a man named Desmond Kane. "And if she's married," Dean said slowly, already not liking where this was headed. "Then those same powers pass to her spouse instead," Silas said. "For as long as the incapacity lasts, up to a maximum of 90 days, after which the courts step in regardless. That's not my problem," Dean said. "I don't know this woman. I've never met her." "No," Silas agreed. "But Warwick Ashworth knew you, and in exchange for one signature, a marriage that requires nothing further of you beyond honoring the guardianship, the estate is prepared to establish a trust fund for your daughter. Full tuition, any school she chooses, for as long as she needs it." Dean looked through the screen door at Della, who was holding up a drawing of a lopsided sun with too many rays taped crookedly to the refrigerator, utterly unaware that her father was being asked, on a Tuesday morning, to marry a woman she would never meet as anything other than a name on a piece of paper. "Why me?" Dean said, and something in his voice had gone quieter. "Warwick was specific," Silas said. "It has to be you. I can't explain the rest of it standing on this porch. But I can tell you that if you don't sign, Desmond Kane gains full authority within 11 days. And Kane has already petitioned once, quietly, to withdraw her care. Whatever you decide it today." Dean stood there a long moment, listening to Della humming something tuneless in the kitchen, and thought about every bill he was behind on, every year he'd told himself things would get easier once he caught a break, and how none of that mattered even a little compared to the number 11 days kept ringing in his head. That evening, he stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Ashworth estate for the first time, the house rising behind manicured hedges like something out of a life that had never once belonged to him. He did not feel wealthy standing there. He felt like a man about to sign something he might not be able to take back, for reasons he did not yet understand, and a debt he did not yet know he owed. The ceremony happened without music, without flowers beyond the ones already wilting on Harlow's nightstand. A hospital chaplain read the vows to a room that held Dean, Silas, 2 witnesses from the estate's legal team, and Harlow, who did not stir once through any of it. Dean repeated the words when he was asked to. His voice did not shake, though his hands did, and he kept them folded behind his back where no one could see. Afterward, Silas asked the room to clear, and when it was just the 2 of them left beside the hum of the monitor, he set a manila folder on the small table by the window. "There's something you should know," Silas said, before you spend the next 90 days wondering why any of this happened. Dean opened the folder. Inside were employment records, 15 years old, the paper gone slightly yellow at the edges, from a firm called Meridian Trust. His own name sat at the top of the first page, beside a termination date and a case file number he had spent a decade and a half trying to forget. "I was a forensic auditor," Dean said quietly, more to himself than to Silas. "Before all of this. Before roofs. You found irregularities in a fund tied to a business partner of Desmond Kane's," Silas said. "You were the only auditor at the firm who reported it instead of burying it. You lost your license over it, and every door in the industry closed behind you within a year. Warwick Ashworth was a silent investor in that fund, Dean. He was never named in the filings, but he knew exactly what you'd found, and what it cost you." Dean sat down slowly in the chair beside Harlow's bed, the folder still open across his knees. 15 years. He had believed the help that trickled in after his ruin had been luck, or some quiet decency he'd never questioned too closely, a debt collector who suddenly backed off, a landlord who conveniently forgot a missed payment, a scholarship that appeared out of nowhere the year his late wife's hospital bills had nearly buried them both. "He knew who I was this whole time," Dean said, "and he never once said a word to me. He didn't want you to feel like you owed him anything," Silas said, "but he never stopped watching. And when he drew up this clause years later, naming a spouse instead of a relative in the event of Harlow's incapacity, he left one condition attached to it in his private notes. Not the will itself. If it ever came to this, it had to be you. Not a lawyer he trusted. Not a business partner. You." Dean looked at Harlow's face for a long moment. Still and unaware. A woman whose father had spent 15 quiet years repaying a debt to a man who hadn't known he was owed anything at all. "This isn't an accident," Dean said finally. "None of this is." "No," Silas said. "It's a debt he waited a very long time to collect on. He's asking you to be the one who protects her, the same way you once told the truth when it would have been easier not to." Across town, in an office on the top floor of Ashworth Capital's tower, Desmond Kane stood at the window overlooking the river, his phone pressed to his ear. "The clock is still running," he said, low and even, watching the lights come on along the waterfront below. 90 days. Nothing has changed. Tell him nothing has changed." He hung up without waiting for a reply, and stood there a while longer, watching his own reflection layered over the city, unbothered, patient, and certain that a roofer with a trust fund attached to his signature would not be a problem for very long. Dean and Della moved into the east wing of the estate before the week was out, 2 suitcases and a box of Della's drawings against a house full of furniture older than either of their lifetimes combined. Dean tried to keep things ordinary for her anyway, cereal, in the same chipped bowl he'd packed from their old kitchen, homework at the same time every evening, the same tired voice, reading the same 3 chapters of the same worn paperback. Even as marble floors and portrait-lined hallways replaced the cracked linoleum she'd grown up walking on, Della adjusted faster than Dean expected her to. Within days, she had named the ornamental fish in the koi pond, made friends with the groundskeeper's dog, and decided, without asking permission, that the house's east sitting room was now hers for building blanket forts. Each evening after dinner, she asked to see the sleeping lady, and Dean, after enough hesitation to make Della roll her eyes at him, began walking her down to Harlow's room. Della would climb onto the edge of a chair, swinging her feet, and tell Harlow about her day in exhaustive, meandering detail: the substitute teacher who mixed up state capitals, the frog she'd found by the creek behind the stable, the fort that had collapsed twice before she got the blanket angle right. She never asked what Harlow did for a living, or why the house was so big, or why her father had married a woman neither of them had chosen to know. To Della, Harlow was simply someone who needed company, and Della had never been short on things to say. Dean sat in the doorway during these visits, arms crossed, watching his daughter talk to a woman who could not answer, and found himself thinking, more than once, that Harlow was lucky to have this kind of company, even if she never woke to remember it. But it was during one of the quieter hours, after Della had gone to bed, that the old instincts Dean thought he'd buried 15 years ago started stirring again without his permission. He'd stepped into Harlow's room to check on her, as he'd taken to doing before turning in himself, and found a printed medication log left on the nightstand, while the night nurse had stepped out to take a call. He hadn't meant to look closely, but something in the pattern of numbers snagged in his memory the way a loose thread catches on a splinter, and once he noticed it, He couldn't stop noticing it. Sedation dosages had been adjusted twice in the past 10 days, each time slightly higher than the prescribing physician's original orders. Both adjustments had occurred on the same 2 dates as visits logged from Desmond Kane. Dean stood very still for a moment, listening to the house settle around him, and then photographed the page with his phone before the nurse returned, saying nothing, asking nothing, filing the discrepancy away, the same careful way he used to file discrepancies in ledgers that weren't supposed to have any. Kane appeared in the East Wing 2 days later, unannounced, smiling the particular way men smile when they already believe they've won something. "Mr. Prescott," he said, glancing around the modest furnishings Dean had brought with him as though they amused him. "Settling in, I trust." "We're managing," Dean said. "Good. Family's important." Kane's eyes drifted toward the closed door of Harlow's room at the end of the hall. "I'd hate for anyone in this house to get confused about their role here. You're a guardian of convenience, Dean. Nothing more, nothing less. I'd advise you not to go looking into things that don't concern you." "I wasn't aware anything concerned me besides looking after her," Dean said evenly. Kane's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Precisely my point," he said, and left without waiting for a response, the sound of his footsteps fading down a hallway he clearly considered his own. Dean stood alone in the corridor a long while after Kane had gone, turning the photograph on his phone over in his mind, and thought that a man who felt the need to warn him off looking was usually a man with something worth finding. Dean waited until the house was fully asleep before he let himself do what he'd been resisting for 2 days. He sat at the small desk in the East Wing with his laptop open, and the folder of trust documents Silas had left with him weeks earlier. Documents he'd only skimmed at the time, unwilling to look too closely at a life that wasn't his to examine. He hadn't touched a real spreadsheet in 15 years, not since the termination letter that ended his career at Meridian Trust, but the old instinct returned the way a hand remembers a piano. It hasn't played in a decade, clumsy at first, then suddenly, uncomfortably fluent. He cross-referenced account numbers against authorization signatures, the same tedious method he'd used to unravel the fraud that cost him everything once before, and told himself this was different. This was just curiosity. Nothing that would put him back in anyone's crosshairs. He found it a little after midnight. A secondary account, nested 3 layers deep inside Harlow's family trust, authorized for withdrawal by exactly 1 signature. Desmond Kane's. Dean sat back from the screen and rubbed his eyes, the way he used to when a number refused to add up the way it should. The account had moved funds twice in the past 6 months, both times in amounts small enough not to draw an outside auditor's attention, both times timed within a week of a scheduled board vote on Ashworth Capital's expansion into a new logistics division that Kane had publicly opposed. He called Silas first thing the next morning, before Della was even awake, and found the man's voice tighter and more careful than he'd heard it since the day they'd first met on that porch. "Dean, listen to me," Silas said. "I am bound by confidentiality agreements tied directly to Warwick's estate. There are things I am not permitted to say to you outright, no matter how much I might want to. But I will tell you this much. Whatever you found, you did not stumble onto it by accident. Be very careful about who knows you're looking." "That's not an answer," Dean said. "It's the only one I can give you right now," Silas said, and the line went quiet before Dean could push further. Dean closed the laptop, unsatisfied but understanding the shape of the warning well enough. He'd heard that same careful tone from lawyers before, back when he still worked in rooms full of them, and it had never once meant nothing. That evening, once Della had fallen asleep with a nightlight glowing against her bedroom wall, Dean walked back down to Harlow's room and sat beside her longer than usual. The house had gone quiet around them, the kind of quiet that made a man notice his own thoughts too clearly. And for the first time since the wedding, Dean spoke to Harlow as though she might actually be listening. "I don't know if any of this makes sense to you," he said, turning the folder over in his hands. "It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either, but your father did something for my family once, a long time ago, and I didn't even know his name until 3 days ago, so I'm going to figure out what's happening in this house. Not because I signed a piece of paper in a room that smelled like flowers dying, because I think somebody's trying to hurt you, and nobody else here seems willing to say that out loud." Harlow's hand did not move. The monitor kept its same soft rhythm, but Dean stayed in the chair beside her until well past 2 in the morning anyway, and when he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her, the way a man looks at something he has quietly decided to protect whether or not anyone ever asked him to. Desmond Kane called an emergency board meeting the following week, citing what he termed, in the memo circulated to every director, urgent governance concerns requiring immediate clarification. When the meeting convened, he argued that the marriage clause itself was invalid on its face, since Harlow had never given conscious consent, and the vows had been read to a woman who could not hear them, a technicality he presented with practiced outrage, ignoring the fact that the trust's own language triggered automatically upon incapacitation and required no consent from anyone at all. Dean was asked to attend, and he sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, in a blazer he'd borrowed from Silas, that fit him half a size too large through the shoulders, aware of every eye in the room weighing him the way people weigh a stranger who has wandered somewhere he clearly doesn't belong. He answered each question with the same measured restraint he used to bring to depositions, years ago, when the truth had been the only thing he had left to hold on to. He did not mention Meridian Trust. He did not mention the 15 years, or the debt, or the folder Silas had shown him. He simply repeated, in the same even tone each time, that he intended to honor his responsibility to Harlow's care until she woke or the 90 days expired, whichever came first, and that he had no interest in anything beyond that. And if she never wakes, one director asked, not unkindly but plainly, then I suppose we'll have that conversation when it happens, Dean said. Not before. The board did not vote that day. Kane had clearly hoped to force a resolution on the spot, and the fact that several directors wanted more time to review the trust language themselves was, Dean understood without being told, its own small victory. Still, the look on Kane's face as the meeting adjourned told Dean the matter was far from settled, and that Kane would not wait long before trying again. That same week, Della came down with a fever, nothing serious, the ordinary kind that comes with too much running around in the heat and goes just as quickly with rest and orange juice, but it landed at the worst possible time regardless. Dean spent 2 nights split between her bedroom and Harlow's, a damp cloth in one hand for his daughter's forehead, a folder of financial records tucked under his other arm for a woman he'd known less than a month. He dozed once in the armchair, positioned in the hallway between both rooms, close enough to hear either of them if they needed him, and woke a little after 4 in the morning with a stiff neck and the particular, hollowed-out clarity of a man carrying 2 responsibilities that had never once asked his permission before landing on him. Della's fever broke by morning. He carried her back to her own bed, still half asleep, and returned to sit with Harlow until the sun came up, unwilling, for reasons he didn't examine too closely, to leave her alone in the house with Kane still walking its halls. Late that same night, long after Dean had gone to sleep himself, a security camera mounted in the east corridor recorded what no one in the house would discover for days yet. Desmond Kane, alone, letting himself into Harlow's room a few minutes past midnight, with a key that should not have opened that particular door, adjusting something on the control panel beside her IV line, before letting himself quietly back out, the hallway settling into darkness behind him as though nothing at all had happened. Mavis Duran had worked in the hospital's records archive for 19 years, filing charts nobody else wanted to touch, and she remembered exactly who Warwick Ashworth was, even if the rest of the hospital staff had already forgotten. 11 years earlier, when her son's college acceptance letter had arrived alongside a tuition bill she could never have covered on her salary, an anonymous donation appeared in the financial aid office 2 weeks later, enough to close the gap entirely. She never found out who had sent it, not until a nurse mentioned, purely in passing one afternoon, that the patient in the private wing on the 4th floor was Warwick Ashworth's daughter. Mavis started paying closer attention after that, the way a person does when a debt they can't repay directly suddenly has a name attached to it. She noticed the same medication logs Dean had glimpsed weeks earlier, though, unlike Dean, she had full access to the hospital's electronic override system behind them, the kind of access that came with 19 years of quiet, unremarkable seniority. She pulled the complete access history for Harlow's care team one slow afternoon between filing tasks and found something that made her sit very still at her desk for a long time before she moved again. Every unauthorized dosage adjustment over the past 2 months had been logged under an override code tied to a single visitor badge, Desmond Kane's. Mavis did not report it through official channels. She had watched over the years how much influence Ashworth Capital's board held over the hospital's own funding and expansion plans, and she was not willing to risk the only steady job she'd had in 2 decades on a hunch that could be quietly buried before it ever reached anyone with the authority to act on it. Instead, she found an old estate contact listed in Harlow's admission paperwork, a name she recognized only because it appeared on so many of the older charts she filed. Silas Doyle. She called him from a payphone outside the hospital's east entrance, one of the last still standing in the city, because she did not trust her own cell records to stay private. Silas arrived at the estate a little after midnight, and Dean met him at the door still half asleep, pulling a sweater over the t-shirt he'd been sleeping in. Silas didn't say a word until they were alone in the study. The door shut behind them, a folder of printouts spread across the desk between them under the single lamp Dean had switched on. "She's not in a coma because of an accident," Silas said quietly. "Not anymore, at least. She's being kept in one." Dean stared at the timestamps, the override codes, the pattern repeating itself with Kane's visits like a signature the man hadn't bothered to disguise well enough, too confident in his own position to imagine anyone would ever go looking. Something in Dean's chest went cold, and then very still. The exact way it used to when he found the first loose thread of a fraud that would eventually unravel an entire fund. "He's been doing this since before I even signed anything," Dean said. "Since before you knew her name," Silas said. "The accident that put her here, the police report calls it a single-vehicle collision. Brakes that failed on a dry road with no skid marks. Nobody's looked at that twice, because nobody had a reason to. Until now." Dean sat down slowly across from the folder. And for the first time since the wedding, he understood, fully and without any remaining distance, that his responsibility to Harlow was not a legal formality he was fulfilling. Until 90 days ran out, and a court finally stepped in. It was a life he was now standing directly between, and the man trying to end it quietly enough that no one would ever think to ask a single question. He walked back to Harlow's room before dawn broke, and sat beside her the way he had every night since the wedding, except this time he did not speak at all. He simply watched the rise and fall of her breathing in the low lamplight, and thought about how close it had come, all this time, to stopping for reasons that had nothing to do with any accident. It happened slowly, the way most real things do. First, a twitch in her fingers that the night nurse nearly missed while adjusting a pillow. Then, 3 days later, her eyelids fluttered during one of Della's evening visits, and Della, delighted rather than frightened, whispered, "Dad, I think the sleeping lady heard the frog story," as though that alone explained everything that needed explaining. Dean didn't sleep much that night, and neither, it turned out, did the machines monitoring Harlow's vitals, which registered small, steady changes through the early hours that the on-call physician described the next morning as encouraging. 2 mornings later, Harlow opened her eyes fully, into a room she did not recognize, beside a man she had never seen before, with a child watching her curiously from a chair by the window. She tried to speak and could not at first, her throat raw and unused after weeks of silence, and the panic that crossed her face was immediate and entirely unguarded, the look of someone waking into a life that no longer matched the last thing she remembered. Dean stood carefully, hands open, no sudden movement, the same way he might approach a spooked animal or a child having a nightmare. "You're safe," he said. "You're home. My name is Dean. I've been looking after things while you were unwell." Harlow's eyes moved from his face to the ring on her own hand, one she did not remember putting on, then back to him again. Uncomprehending, her mind still stitching together weeks it had no memory of at all. "Looking after things," she repeated, her voice a dry rasp. "What things?" Dean did not explain the marriage that day, sensing correctly that it was far too much to hand someone who had only just remembered how to keep her eyes open. He simply told her he had been appointed her guardian during her recovery, and that there would be time for every question once she had her strength back properly. Harlow, too exhausted to argue, and too disoriented yet to fully trust her own instincts, let the explanation sit unanswered, filing the stranger beside her bed under a single, temporary label, the guardian. The same surface distance he had learned, without either of them discussing it, to keep with her from the very beginning of all this. Della, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the formality hanging in the air between the two adults. She scooted her chair a little closer to the bed and said matter-of-factly, "You have really pretty hair, even messy like that," which was the first thing Harlow had heard since waking that made her almost, briefly, smile. 3 days into her recovery, still confined mostly to the bed while her strength slowly returned, Harlow overheard her own phone ringing on the nightstand and, out of habit more than clear thinking, answered it before anyone in the room could stop her. It was Desmond Kane. calling what he clearly believed was a private line to his own attorney. And for a moment, the call connected fully before either man on the other end realized Harlow herself was listening. "Just need her kept under for a few more weeks," Kane was saying, his voice clipped and businesslike. "Once the vote passes, none of this will—" The line went dead. The instant Kane's attorney noticed the extra connection on the call, but Harlow sat frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear, the words repeating themselves in a mind still fogged from weeks of unconsciousness. Kept under. A few more weeks. She did not yet understand every piece of what she had just heard, but she understood more than enough to know that something about her own long, slow recovery had never entirely been left to chance, and that the man on the other end of that call was someone she had trusted with her whole life since she was a child. Desmond Kane called an emergency board session within the week, arguing that Harlow's continued incapacity, conveniently vague on paper, since the official record showed only that her recovery was ongoing, required immediate reassignment of guardianship to himself, along with what he termed long-term care oversight that would keep her removed from any real decision-making authority indefinitely for her own protection, he insisted, in a tone that almost convinced the newer directors at the table. Silas arrived with Mavis Duran's full access logs printed and bound, timestamps highlighted in yellow down each page. Mavis herself refused to appear in person, unwilling to risk the only steady job she'd held in 19 years on a board she did not trust to protect her afterward. But she had recorded a sworn video statement instead, her voice steady despite the visible fear behind her eyes, describing exactly what she had found in the hospital systems and precisely why she had gone to Silas rather than her own supervisors. Dean stood next and presented the financial trail he had traced weeks earlier at a desk in the middle of the night. The nested account 3 layers deep, the single authorizing signature that belonged to the man sitting at the head of the table. The board chairman had barely called for a vote when the door at the far end of the room opened and Harlow walked in. She was thinner than the photograph printed in the company's own annual report, still moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone relearning her own legs, one hand braced lightly against the doorframe for balance. But her voice, when she finally spoke, did not waver. "I'd like to say something," she said, "before any of you vote on my own life without me in the room." The room went completely silent. Kane's face drained of color in a way that told everyone present, more clearly than any document on the table could have, exactly how little he had ever expected her to walk back through that door again, let alone with enough strength left to speak. Harlow did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She laid out, plainly and without embellishment, what she had overheard on a phone call 3 days earlier, what Silas and Dean had since shown her in private, and asked the board directly whether they intended to hand permanent oversight of her recovery to the one man whose visitor badge appeared, again and again, beside every unauthorized change to her medication. The vote came 6-1. Desmond Kane was removed from every position he held within Ashworth Capital before the meeting even formally adjourned, his access to every system revoked within the hour, and by the time he reached the lobby downstairs, 2 detectives from the Savannah Police Department were already waiting for him near the elevators. As they walked him out between them, Kane looked back once, not toward the board members filing out behind him, but directly at Harlow. "Ask your father why he really trusted a stranger over his own family," he said, his voice carrying easily across the marble lobby. "Ask him what he never told you." The detectives pulled him forward before Harlow could answer, his voice swallowed by the closing elevator doors. But the question stayed behind in the room long after Kane himself had gone. An open door Harlow hadn't known was there, standing quietly ajar at the edge of everything she thought she'd just finished settling. Dean stood a step behind her through all of it, close enough to steady her if her legs gave out, saying nothing the way he had learned, over these past weeks, to simply be present without needing to be asked. Harlow spent the following weeks rebuilding her strength in slow, deliberate increments. Short walks around the garden that grew a little longer each day, and quietly rebuilding her understanding of the 90 days she had slept through without any memory of them at all. Silas finally released himself from the confidentiality that had bound him for months, and handed her a letter her father had written and sealed years before his own death, meant only for her eyes, and only if the emergency clause was ever triggered. In it, Warwick explained, briefly and without excess sentiment, that a man named Dean Prescott had once told the truth when it cost him everything he had, and that Warwick had spent every year since quietly making sure Dean's family never suffered further for it, without Dean ever knowing why or by whose hand. The letter did not romanticize the arrangement he'd built into his will. It simply said that if Harlow was ever in a position where she needed protecting and could not protect herself, he wanted someone standing over her who had already proven, at considerable cost to himself, that he could not be bought by anyone, for any price. Harlow read the letter twice in the quiet of her own room, then folded it carefully and did not immediately go looking for Dean to discuss any of it. Some things, she decided, were better understood slowly than explained all at once. Instead, days later, she found him in the estate's small study going over invoices for repairs the house had needed for years, and asked him, without much preamble, to lead a newly formed internal audit division at Ashworth Capital, one with real authority and a direct line to her own office, without ever once mentioning Meridian Trust, or the 15 years, or the debt her father had spent so long quietly repaying. Dean looked at her for a long moment before answering, and something passed between them that neither one put into words. He accepted with a simple nod, understanding without being told that some things were better left exactly as they were known between them now, but unspoken, the way a debt settles quietly, once both people finally understand its shape. "You could have asked me why," Harlow said. "You could have told me without asking," Dean said. Neither of them elaborated further, and neither of them needed to. That same week, Harlow found herself in the sitting room one evening while Della recounted, in exhaustive and thoroughly unnecessary detail, a science fair volcano that had erupted 3 days ahead of schedule in the garage, coating half a shelf of paint cans in fake lava before anyone noticed. Harlow listened the way she once had while unconscious, except now she could ask questions, and she laughed once, briefly, at exactly the wrong moment in the story, which only made Della laugh harder and start the whole account over again from the beginning. Watching them together from the doorway, Dean thought, not for the first time, that his daughter had somehow arrived at an understanding of Harlow that had taken the rest of the house considerably longer to reach, that she was simply someone worth sitting with, nothing more complicated than that, and that whatever debts or contracts had brought the three of them together under one roof, none of it seemed to matter much to an 8-year-old, who had already decided, weeks ago, that Harlow was someone she liked. 90 days from the wedding, the clause that had bound them expired quietly, with no ceremony and no notice from anyone but Silas, who sent a single brief email confirming that either party was now free to file for annulment without cause or further explanation required from either side. Neither of them did. Dean spent that Saturday morning repairing a section of the estate's back porch roof that had been sagging since long before he'd ever set foot on the property, not because anyone had asked him to, and not because his guardianship required anything more of him now that it had technically ended. He simply noticed it needed fixing, the same way he'd noticed 100 small things about the house over the past 3 months, and decided, without much discussion with himself, that it was worth his Saturday. Harlow watched him from the kitchen window for longer than she meant to, coffee cooling in her hands, her thumb resting absently against the ring she had never once tried to remove, not even after Silas's email had made it entirely optional to keep wearing it. She thought about the letter still folded in her nightstand drawer. About 15 years her father had spent quietly making sure a stranger's family never went without, and about how strange it was that the 90 days meant to protect her from one man had ended up introducing her to another one entirely. Della ran past the porch toward the garden a few minutes later, calling back over her shoulder without slowing down for a response. "Miss Harlow, come see my flowers. The yellow ones opened this morning." The name arriving easily now, worn smooth from weeks and weeks of quiet practice. No longer a stranger's title borrowed for politeness, but something closer to a fact. Harlow set her coffee down on the counter and walked outside anyway. Dean glanced down from the ladder when he heard the screen door, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them comfortable now in a way it had taken 3 months. One attempted murder, and a boardroom vote to earn honestly. He climbed down, wiping his hands on his jeans the same way he had on the day Silas Doyle first found him on another roof entirely, and stood beside her at the edge of the garden while Della crouched over a row of daffodils, narrating their opening progress in painstaking detail to an audience of 2 who were only half listening to the flowers and mostly listening to each other. "You didn't have to fix that roof," Harlow said eventually. "No," Dean agreed. "I didn't." She didn't ask him to explain further, and he didn't offer to. Some things, they had both learned by now, said more clearly in the doing than they ever could in the telling, and neither one of them felt any particular hurry to change that, Not that morning. Not with the garden warm around them and a little girl calling out the names of flowers she'd only just learned herself. The vow had been forced. The marriage had not.